The case didn't arrive. It surfaced. That distinction mattered immediately. There was no report, no request, no assignment number attached to it. Just a gap that kept repeating in different places. A name mentioned once in a meeting and never again. A desk that had been cleared too thoroughly. An access badge deactivated without a replacement. None of this triggered alarms. It shouldn't have. Individually, each detail was forgettable. Together, they formed a negative space that refused to stay empty. I noticed it because I'd learned to look for absences that behaved like presences. People remember mistakes. They don't remember corrections done cleanly enough. I started asking neutral questions, not about the person, but about the work that had stopped moving around the same time. Projects stalled. Responsibilities redistributed. Decisions delayed without explanation. When I asked who had been coordinating before, the answers blurred. Not contradictory. Incomplete. That's always worse. Incompleteness means memory has been edited gently. I checked records expecting to find reassignment or removal. There was neither. The person had not been transferred. Not retired. Not terminated. The system behaved as if the role had never been occupied at all. That's not erasure. That's preemption. I asked myself the only question that mattered then. How do you investigate something that officially never entered the system? The answer was uncomfortable. You don't follow evidence. You follow behavior. People adjust around absence the same way they adjust around threat. I watched who avoided certain rooms. Who hesitated when timelines crossed a specific month. Who changed subject when I mentioned a project name that no longer existed in the archive. These reactions weren't coordinated. That's what made them credible. Fear can be synchronized. Memory usually can't. I realized then that this wasn't a disappearance meant to hide a crime. It was a removal meant to stabilize a future. Someone hadn't been erased because of what they did. They'd been erased because of what they might have caused if they'd stayed. That's a different category entirely. And it meant this investigation wouldn't move forward the way the others had. There would be no interface to confront. No operator to observe. Only a past that had been adjusted so precisely that even suspicion felt inappropriate. I wrote the name down anyway. Not in a file. On paper. I'd learned that lesson already. Digital systems remember selectively. Paper remembers everything until you choose not to look at it. That was how episode 5 began. Not with a crime. Not with a victim. But with the unsettling realization that someone had been removed so early, so completely, that even the system didn't consider it a correction. It considered it maintenance. I didn't find the witness. He found me. Not directly. That would have been too clean. Instead, he hovered at the edge of relevance for days before stepping forward. A name that surfaced in unrelated contexts. A reference in a meeting that didn't require one. A question asked twice by different people using almost the same phrasing. Patterns don't announce themselves. They repeat until you notice. I traced the repetition back and realized it always ended with the same person quietly exiting the conversation. He wasn't avoiding attention. He was timing his absence. That's a skill learned under pressure. I waited for a moment when he had no audience and asked something deliberately vague. Not about the case. About a month. He froze. Not visibly. Internally. You can tell when someone is deciding whether memory is worth the risk. He answered carefully, as if choosing which parts of time were safe to acknowledge. Then he said something that confirmed everything without naming it. People don't remember him because remembering makes work harder. That was the first time anyone had admitted there was a him. Not officially. Not on record. Just in speech. He didn't describe events. He described effects. Projects that lost coherence. Decisions that felt heavier afterward. A sense that someone used to connect things that no longer connected themselves. He spoke in negatives, not facts. Negatives are safer. You can't prove them wrong. I asked why he hadn't said anything earlier. He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice didn't lower. That mattered. Fear lowers voices. Calculation steadies them. Because there's no category for what happened, he said. And things without categories get corrected. He wasn't exaggerating. Systems rely on classification to decide response. Without a category, there's only adjustment. That's more dangerous. I asked whether he'd ever spoken to anyone else about this. He hesitated just long enough to tell me the truth. People talk, he said. But not forward. That phrase stayed with me. Information was circulating sideways, not upward. That meant the system hadn't acknowledged the gap yet. It also meant it was being managed informally. Informal management is how truths survive long enough to become inconvenient. He wasn't a witness in the legal sense. He had no evidence. No documents. No timestamps. Just continuity. He remembered how things felt before the absence and after. That kind of memory isn't admissible, but it's powerful. It resists correction because it's embodied. I asked him directly whether he believed the person had done something wrong. He shook his head without hesitation. He asked the wrong questions, he said. Too early. That explained the precision of the removal. This wasn't damage control. It was timeline control. Someone had accelerated insight before the system was ready to absorb it. The safest response wasn't to refute it. It was to remove the source before the insight propagated. I asked what happened to him afterward. The witness looked past me, not at me. That's how people recall events they've learned not to revisit. Nothing, he said. That's the point. No fallout. No investigation. No warning. Just a smooth reconfiguration that made the past incompatible with present records. That kind of correction requires coordination. But not visible coordination. It requires consensus without conversation. I realized then that this witness wasn't coming forward to accuse anyone. He was testing whether memory still had value. Whether saying the wrong thing to the wrong person would trigger the same response again. I didn't reassure him. Reassurance closes doors. I listened instead. That was enough. When he left, he didn't ask what I planned to do. People who've lived through quiet corrections don't ask that question. They know outcomes don't depend on intention. They depend on tolerance. I sat alone afterward and understood the new constraint clearly. Episode 5 wouldn't be about reconstructing a disappearance. It would be about protecting memory long enough to see what the system does with it next. Because once someone remembers out loud, the system has to decide whether to correct again, or adapt in a different direction. And whichever it chose would tell me more than any file ever could. The records didn't contradict each other at first. That would have been too obvious. Contradictions invite investigation. What I found instead was alignment that felt forced, like a story told too consistently by people who hadn't rehearsed together. Dates matched too cleanly. Responsibility transferred without friction. Gaps existed, but they were evenly spaced, almost polite. That's how you know something has been adjusted after the fact. Real history is messy. It resists symmetry. I pulled the earliest version of the project archive I could access and compared it to the current one line by line. Nothing dramatic changed. No deletions. No redactions. Just substitutions. Names replaced with roles. Roles replaced with processes. Processes collapsed into outcomes. Over time, the human element thinned until the work appeared to have happened on its own. That's not documentation. That's optimization of memory. I checked system logs next, expecting at least timestamps to disagree. They didn't. Instead, I found something more troubling. The logs had been updated in batches, long after the fact, but marked as contemporaneous. That meant someone hadn't erased history. They'd resynchronized it. The system hadn't lost memory. It had corrected it retroactively. That requires authority, but not the kind you sign for. It requires access to narrative layers most people don't even know exist. I remembered what the witness had said. There was no category for what happened. Categories are how systems decide what to preserve. Without one, preservation becomes optional. I tested this by searching for anomalies tied to other periods. Smaller ones. Less sensitive. I found the same pattern repeating quietly. Self-correcting records that smoothed uncertainty into inevitability. The system wasn't just erasing individuals. It was teaching itself to preempt friction by editing continuity. That's when I understood why this person had been removed so early. He hadn't threatened outcomes. He'd threatened the story that justified them. Stories are more fragile than decisions. Decisions can be defended. Stories have to feel natural. I noticed something else then. The corrections weren't centralized. Different departments showed similar edits, but executed independently. That meant the impulse to correct had been internalized. People weren't being instructed to adjust records. They were doing it instinctively. That's how systems mature. Control stops being enforced and starts being anticipated. I traced one particular change back to a mid-level analyst who had no reason to intervene. When I asked him about it casually, he looked genuinely confused. He believed the record had always looked that way. That wasn't dishonesty. It was adaptation. He'd inherited the corrected version and built his understanding on top of it. That's the most durable kind of erasure. You don't remove memory. You replace the foundation beneath it. I realized then that proving the person had existed was becoming irrelevant. The system no longer needed to deny it. It had moved past the point where denial mattered. The absence had been normalized. The work still made sense without attribution. In fact, it made more sense. That's the danger. Clean systems are persuasive. They make you doubt the necessity of friction. I asked myself whether uncovering this mattered if no one could act on it. The answer wasn't comforting. It mattered because it revealed direction. Systems that correct their own records aren't preserving truth. They're preserving efficiency. And efficiency, when prioritized over continuity, eventually consumes accountability entirely. I checked one last thing before closing the files. A backup archive that hadn't been touched in years. It still contained the original entries. Imperfect. Incomplete. Human. That meant the past hadn't been destroyed. It had been quarantined. Stored somewhere inconvenient enough that no one consulted it unless they already suspected something was wrong. That's not accidental. It's designed for plausible ignorance. I sat back then and felt the weight of it settle. Episode 5 wasn't about finding a missing person anymore. It was about deciding whether a past that no longer fit the present could still exert pressure. The witness had been right. There was no category for this. And things without categories get corrected. Unless someone refuses to let them be classified out of existence. I understood then what my role had quietly become. Not investigator. Not whistleblower. Custodian of an incompatible memory. That's a lonely position. And it meant the next part wouldn't involve records at all. It would involve space. Physical space. The one room people avoided because it hadn't been fully corrected yet. No one told me not to go there. That was the first thing that made the room noticeable. Warnings leave traces. Avoidance does not. The room existed in schedules, on floor plans, in maintenance logs that proved it was still serviced regularly. Lights replaced. Air circulated. Security checks logged on time. Everything suggested normal use. And yet no one used it. Meetings that should have happened there were quietly reassigned. Storage requests rerouted. Even cleaning schedules were adjusted so staff entered it less often than protocol required. The system hadn't closed the room. It had made it socially unnecessary. That's the most effective form of decommissioning. I approached it without urgency, letting my presence blend into routine. The hallway outside felt different, not ominous, just underutilized. Sound traveled oddly there. Footsteps echoed longer than they should have. That happens in spaces people stop inhabiting emotionally before they stop inhabiting physically. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. Nothing dramatic greeted me. No evidence board. No abandoned files. Just furniture arranged too carefully. A table centered with unnecessary precision. Chairs aligned as if awaiting people who never arrived. The room felt paused. Not empty. Suspended. I sat down and waited. Waiting is how you let a place reveal its habits. Dust patterns told me which areas were disturbed occasionally and which were left untouched. One chair showed more wear than the others. Not enough to register as use. Enough to register as preference. Someone had sat there often. Not recently. But consistently, once. I checked the wall-mounted calendar still hanging near the door. Months old. The final entry was a meeting that had been rescheduled indefinitely. No cancellation note. Just delay without destination. That's how time gets stranded. I remembered the witness mentioning coordination that no longer connected itself. This room had been a node. A place where things converged briefly before dispersing. Removing the person hadn't eliminated the function. It had just displaced it until the room itself became obsolete. I noticed something else then. The room wasn't being avoided because of fear. It was being avoided because it created questions people couldn't answer anymore. Why was this space here? What purpose had it served? Spaces that demand explanation are inconvenient. They interrupt flow. I checked the network port under the table and found it still active. That mattered. Digital traces linger longer than human ones, but only if no one thinks to sever them. I accessed the last known activity from that location. The logs didn't show content. Just duration. Long sessions. Frequent returns. Someone had spent time here thinking, not executing. That kind of work doesn't generate outcomes easily recorded. It generates pressure. I realized then why the room hadn't been repurposed. Repurposing would have required acknowledging its prior function. Easier to let it exist and use than to explain what it once facilitated. I stood and moved toward the window, noticing the blinds were angled differently from the rest of the building. Not open. Not closed. Set to admit light without visibility. A compromise. The kind someone makes when they want to observe without being observed. I understood then that this room hadn't been neutral. It had been designed for ambiguity. And ambiguity, when left unmanaged, invites insight. That was likely where the person had crossed the line. Not by doing something wrong. By thinking too freely, too early, in a space that allowed connections the system wasn't ready to absorb. I felt the unease deepen. This wasn't a crime scene. It was a thinking space that had outlived its thinker. The system hadn't erased it because erasing space draws attention. Instead, it had isolated it socially. People learn quickly which places cost them momentum. They stop going there without being told. I checked the room one last time before leaving. Nothing to photograph. Nothing to document. Just alignment slightly off from standard. chairs too straight. Silence too intact. That's when I realized the room hadn't been corrected because it didn't need to be. It was already doing the work of discouragement on its own. I locked the door behind me and felt the weight of it linger. Spaces like this don't disappear. They wait. And anyone who enters them long enough starts asking questions that no longer fit the present. I knew then that episode 5 was moving toward its most dangerous territory. Not evidence. Not witnesses. Memory anchored to physical space. Because you can correct records. You can manage people. But spaces remember in ways systems can't fully anticipate. And someone else, I suspected, had noticed that too. Memory doesn't announce itself as unreliable. That's what makes it dangerous. It feels solid while it's forming, anchored to sensation, posture, the weight of a room or the tone of a voice. Evidence asks to be checked. Memory asks to be trusted. Systems don't like trust unless they can quantify it. I understood that more clearly after leaving the room everyone avoided. Nothing I'd seen there could be entered into a report. There were no documents, no recordings, no witnesses willing to testify to its function. Just a sense of continuity that refused to collapse into absence. I carried that sense with me, and it immediately became a liability. I noticed it in how people responded when I referenced the room obliquely. Not denial. Deflection. They didn't say it hadn't been used. They said it wasn't relevant anymore. Relevance is how systems retire uncomfortable memories without erasing them outright. I began testing the limits of that logic. I described the room without naming it. A space where decisions once paused. Where connections were made tentatively instead of efficiently. People nodded along until they realized what I was describing. Then the nodding stopped. That's the moment memory collides with maintenance. Maintenance always wins in the short term. I asked myself whether I was building a case or simply accumulating impressions that would never cohere into action. The witness had warned me. There was no category for this. Without a category, there's no procedural response. And without response, there's only endurance. I watched how endurance manifested in myself. A tightening in the chest when I revisited certain threads. A reluctance to articulate what I knew because articulation would invite correction. That's how memory starts self-regulating. You don't need censorship. You need fatigue. I realized then that the system didn't need to erase the past. It needed to make remembering exhausting. That's more effective. Exhaustion looks like choice. People believe they're letting go voluntarily. I tried to externalize the memory anyway. I spoke to someone who hadn't been present during the period in question. Younger. Unmarked. I described the absence, the room, the corrections to records. He listened carefully, then asked the question I'd been avoiding. What exactly happened? I didn't have an answer that satisfied him. That wasn't because nothing happened. It was because what happened didn't resolve into an event. It was a shift. A redirection. Systems are built to absorb shifts without documenting them. That's their strength. And their weakness. The younger analyst nodded slowly and said, "Then how do you know you're right?" That question mattered more than any accusation. It forced me to confront the limits of my position. I knew because the system behaved differently afterward. Because people adjusted. Because space emptied. Because memory clustered where it wasn't supposed to. None of that was admissible. All of it was real. I thought again of the person who had been removed before becoming a problem. He hadn't left evidence behind. He'd left distortion. And distortion is harder to explain than absence. I realized then why memory is treated as suspect here. Memory resists optimization. It doesn't scale. It doesn't replicate cleanly. Each person remembers slightly differently. That variability is intolerable to systems built on consistency. So memory is downgraded to anecdote. Anecdote to rumor. Rumor to noise. Noise can be ignored without consequence. I felt the pressure to stop pressing. To let the investigation fade into something personal, unofficial, safely irrelevant. That's how systems win without confrontation. They wait for the investigator to internalize the cost. I noticed I was doing it already. Choosing words more carefully. Omitting connections I didn't feel ready to defend. That's when I understood the true function of correction at this stage. It wasn't about stopping me. It was about training me. Training me to live with knowing something that couldn't be proven. That's a heavy load. Heavier than ignorance. I returned to the room once more, not to find anything new, but to confirm whether memory changed when revisited. It didn't. The room felt the same. Paused. Neutral. Waiting. That steadiness mattered. It meant memory anchored to place is harder to exhaust. People tire. Rooms do not. I sat there longer this time, letting the absence speak without interruption. I didn't take notes. Notes create obligation. I let the memory remain uncommitted. That was the only way to keep it from being classified and corrected. When I left, I didn't lock the door. Not deliberately. Just as a test. The next day, it was locked again. That told me enough. Someone was still watching the space. Still managing it. Not because it was dangerous now, but because it could become so again if memory gathered momentum. Episode 5 was approaching its final turn. The system had tolerated memory as long as it stayed fragmented. But fragments tend to align eventually. And when they do, someone always decides whether alignment is allowed to continue, or whether the past needs to be removed a second time. The past wasn't erased. That was the first misconception I had to let go of. Erasure leaves scars. Gaps. Angry questions. What happened here was cleaner. The past had been rendered incompatible with the present. It still existed, technically, but it could no longer connect to anything that mattered. Like an old file format no modern system could open without specialized tools. I noticed it when I tried to cross-reference timelines manually. Dates aligned, but causality didn't. Actions existed without consequences. Decisions without authors. The chain had been broken deliberately, link by link, until reconstruction required assumptions no one was willing to defend. That's how you remove the past without touching it. You don't destroy records. You destroy continuity. I tested this theory by pulling a minor incident from years earlier, unrelated to the person in question. The same treatment appeared there too, though less refined. Outcomes documented. Process summarized. Human involvement abstracted away. The system had been practicing. What I was seeing now was a perfected method. Someone had realized that the most dangerous thing about the past isn't what it contains, but how easily it can be connected forward. So they severed the connectors. People still remembered fragments. Rooms still held impressions. But nothing linked cleanly enough to form a narrative that demanded response. I traced the method backward and saw the logic clearly. First, you remove names from documents. Then you replace names with roles. Then you replace roles with outcomes. Finally, you describe outcomes as inevitable. Inevitability is the most powerful anesthetic. Once something is inevitable, no one asks who made it so. I wondered who had authorized this approach. The answer, disturbingly, was no one. Authority had emerged from repetition. Enough people making the same adjustment independently until it solidified into norm. That's how systems evolve beyond control. They stop needing permission. I thought of the witness again, of how carefully he'd chosen his words. He wasn't afraid of reprisal. He was afraid of irrelevance. Of speaking about something that no longer had a place to land. That fear was justified. I tried to reconstruct the removed person's influence one last time, not through files or testimony, but through downstream effects. What decisions shifted afterward? What projects changed direction subtly? What conversations stopped happening altogether? The pattern was there, but it required belief to see it. And belief is a currency this system refuses to recognize. I realized then that the past hadn't been removed because it was wrong. It had been removed because it was inconvenient. It introduced optionality where the system needed closure. Optionality invites responsibility. Responsibility slows things down. The system chose speed over accountability and adjusted history accordingly. I felt the weight of that settle into something heavier than frustration. It was resignation mixed with clarity. There would be no exposure. No dramatic revelation. Anyone I convinced would immediately face the same problem I had, knowing something that couldn't be operationalized. That knowledge isolates you. It makes you careful. And careful people don't disrupt systems. They adapt around them. That's when I saw the final layer of the correction. The system wasn't just managing information. It was shaping psychology. Teaching people which kinds of knowing were survivable. I stood again outside the room everyone avoided and understood why it remained intact. It was the last place where continuity still made sense intuitively. Where the past hadn't been reformatted yet. That made it dangerous. Not because of what it contained, but because of what it could restore if used improperly. I checked access logs and saw they'd tightened. Fewer entries. Shorter durations. Someone had decided the room was becoming too porous. The past was being removed a second time, this time preemptively. I understood then that episode 5 couldn't end with recovery. It would end with consequence. Once you notice how the past is removed, you can't participate in its replacement without becoming part of the mechanism. And once you refuse, you mark yourself. Not as a threat. As a complication. Complications don't get erased. They get managed. I felt the system closing gently around the edges of my inquiry, not to stop it, but to ensure it couldn't propagate. That's when I knew the final part wouldn't be about what happened before. It would be about what happens next, after the past has been quietly taken away, and memory is all that remains to challenge the present. You don't feel the moment it becomes impossible to walk away. That's the last illusion this kind of investigation gives you. There's no line you cross, no decision you announce to yourself. It happens quietly, the way habits form. One day you realize you've stopped asking whether to continue and started asking how to live with what you already know. That's when walking away stops being an option. I felt it after the access logs tightened. After the room everyone avoided became officially inconvenient. After conversations adjusted around me without confrontation. The system wasn't reacting aggressively anymore. It was accommodating my presence just enough to neutralize its impact. Accommodation is more dangerous than resistance. Resistance sharpens resolve. Accommodation dulls it. I understood then that the investigation had already reached its conclusion, even though nothing had been resolved. The past wasn't coming back. The person wouldn't be reinstated in memory or record. The system had succeeded in doing what it always does best, making continuity optional. What remained was me, carrying an incompatible understanding of how things actually worked. That understanding didn't demand action. It demanded restraint. I noticed how often I was tempted to explain everything to someone new, only to stop mid-thought. Not because I was afraid, but because explanation would force the knowledge into shapes the system could manage. Some truths survive only if they remain incomplete. I learned to speak around them instead. To let others arrive at the edge themselves. That's slower. But it's harder to correct. I watched the witness fade back into routine, his risk spent, his memory intact but dormant. I watched the reused people continue their work, a little quieter now, a little heavier. I watched the other observer recalibrate his role, becoming less visible, less effective, safer. The system had absorbed everyone without appearing to change at all. That's when it became clear what this kind of investigation really costs. Not your job. Not your safety. Your simplicity. You lose the ability to believe that systems are merely flawed. You start seeing the intelligence behind their adjustments, the intentionality in their silences. That awareness isolates you, not because others reject it, but because they don't need it to function. I thought again of the room, now locked more often than not. It remained a quiet anchor, proof that something once existed that didn't fit neatly into the present. I realized then that spaces like that are temporary. They survive only until memory loses momentum. Eventually, they get repurposed. Renamed. Forgotten. The system is patient. It doesn't rush erasure. It waits for relevance to decay on its own. I asked myself whether any of this mattered if nothing could be reversed. The answer came slowly, and I didn't like it at first. It mattered because forgetting had been made easy on purpose. Because remembering required effort now. And effort changes people. Not dramatically. Subtly. It teaches them where pressure lives and how to move without triggering it. That knowledge doesn't disappear once acquired. It reshapes you permanently. You don't investigate this and walk away unchanged. You carry it into every future decision. You notice when stories feel too clean. When outcomes appear inevitable. When rooms empty without explanation. You hesitate where others move forward confidently. That hesitation is expensive. It costs opportunity. It costs belonging. But it preserves something else, continuity. Not the system's version. Yours. I didn't publish a report. I didn't file a conclusion. I didn't close the case because it had never officially opened. That was the final correction. The system doesn't need your compliance. It only needs your silence to look voluntary. I chose not to give it that satisfaction. Not by speaking loudly. By remaining present in a way that refused to normalize what I'd seen. That refusal doesn't change outcomes quickly. It changes trajectories slowly, if at all. But it leaves residue. And residue is what systems eventually have to account for. This wasn't a victory. It wasn't even resistance. It was persistence. The kind that doesn't announce itself and can't be easily categorized. The kind that stays inconvenient long after attention moves on. Episode 5 ended the way it had to, not with answers, but with a condition. Once you understand how the past can be removed without being erased, you can't participate in forgetting the same way again. You become careful with inevitability. Suspicious of smoothness. And aware that some investigations don't conclude because their purpose was never to fix anything. It was to show you what walking away would actually cost.